Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Catalan opening with the move knight b to d7 in the Open Catalan, which is one of the 9 theoretical moves black could play, starting in this position. So we are looking at knight b to d7. Now the other moves that so far we have covered b5, but we are also going to be looking at a6, which is the main line, knight c6, the second most common move, c5, bishop b4 check, bishop d7, c6, and bishop e7. So the Open Catalan can occur via many different move orders. That's the first thing I would like to emphasize. Here I'm going to show you a position that starts with knight f6, but we could also start with 1 d5 for black. Here white could play knight f3, allowing black the opportunity to play the Bogo Indian with bishop b4 or the Queen's Indian with b6. But if black plays d5, then g3 is the Catalan, and the Open Catalan occurs when d takes c4 is played. For all of this in more detail, watch the introductory video to the playlist on the Catalan. You can find it in the description below. Today I'm just going to be focusing on something more advanced, which is this position after bishop to g2 and knight b to d7. Now the move knight b to d7 has been used in the past, and I would say it's somewhat of an old move. Smyslov and Korchnoi have played it, and today almost no top grandmaster plays this move. The reason why this move is not played anymore is because it doesn't provide black with enough activity and enough fighting chances. And even though the move is quite logical, prepares to play either knight b6, defending the pawn temporarily, or prepares so knight b6 to defend the c4 pawn, or prepares rook b8, which is very interesting. There are more important developing moves or prophylactic moves than knight b to d7. That being said, the move knight b d7 is not bad. It's just not good enough for 2800 players compared to, let's say, a6. But that doesn't mean that it's not a good weapon for us. And it also doesn't mean that if you play the Catalan with white that you shouldn't know it, because if you don't know it, you can still lose a game fairly quickly. So, knight b d7. So as I said, there are two ideas behind this move, knight b6 or rook b8. Also rook b8 in combination with a6 b5. So by this knight having left the b8 square, it's becoming easier for black to try and defend his pawn. White has 3 options. White can play the move castles, which is the main continuation. He could play knight b to d2, which, as I'll show you, leads to one of the very dangerous simplifications in regards to white's advantage, which happens if the knight gets to b6. White plays knight b d2 takes, and then a trade happens, in which case black has basically traded off his b8 knight for white's b2 knight, for white's b1 knight. White has regained his pawn, and the pawn structure should be slightly better for white, because white has a central pawn for a c pawn, but it should be equal. And that happens after knight b to d2. So these are the two continuations. One continuation, which is, if you only look at the number of games, the most popular one is queen a4. The problem is that queen a4 will lead to a transposition to early queen a4 lines. What do I mean by that? If we look at the position after g3 and d takes c4, something we are going to be covering in a separate video are queen a4 check positions, where white simply tries to either regain the pawn or regain the pawn and move later. They could also occur, just give me one more second, from this position here without knight f3. So d5, bishop g2, d takes c4, queen a4 check. Or they could occur from this position with knight f3 and without bishop g2, which is the most common way for queen a4 to be played. And now after knight b to d7, you can see that we have the same position we would have if queen a4 was played after knight b d7. So queen a4 is a transposition we are not going to be focusing on in this video. I'm just going to show it briefly. And then we are going to be covering that separately. So in fact, let's start with queen a4 just to get that out of the way. So if black plays knight b d7, the idea behind queen a4 is to simply take back the pawn. Now this, as I said, is a very common theoretical line for white, but the problem is that It takes time to regain that pawn, and that gives black the time to expand his expand on the queen side, gain ground on the queen side, and get a very good bishop pair. Or white has the two bishops still, but black's bishop pair will be very good if white allows all of that. So let me give you an example. So queen a4, preparing to take on c4, and now a6. Now white, of course, doesn't have to take on c4 straight away. White's second most common move is knight to c3, where b5 is of course impossible because of knight takes b5. But let's say queen takes c4, and now black's logical follow-up is b5. And now you can immediately see that this bishop is going to have a great time on b7. The other bishop will come to c5 after c5 is played. And this looks like an extremely good semi-Slav for black, where white has fianchettoed his bishop. So white is basically playing a Catalan against the semi-Slav. So I myself, I'm very subjective towards these positions. Whenever the c8 bishop gets to b7 and c5 can be played, and here c5 really cannot be prevented, black is basically equal, and that's the case here. So white has two options, queen c6 or queen c2. Queen c6 is the more aggressive choice. Queen c2, I think, is, well, slightly better. So queen c2 and bishop b7, of course, white castles, and black plays c5. And as you can see, black has absolutely no issues here. The only way for white to try and complicate things is to strike at the king side straight away. But now that the rook has been defended, and of course the rook can move, I really don't think there are many issues. After c5, white could also simply take d takes c5, and after bishop takes c5, play knight c3. And now again, you can see that the pawn structure, even the pawn structure, is symmetrical. I'd argue that black's bishops are better than white's. I would say that white's knights are better than black's, and white has a slight lead in development. Or actually, it's equal. Black is yet to castle, and white is yet to develop his bishop. But black shouldn't have any issues here. So my recommendation is that if you don't play early queen a4 check lines, and again, we are going to go over that in a separate video, then against knight b to d7, I wouldn't recommend queen a4 lines. I think there are better continuations, because when you play queen a4 check, then black can play knight b to d7 to get into these positions. The reason why black doesn't play knight b to d7 before you play queen a4 check is because those positions are okay for him. The reason why he doesn't play knight b d7 first is because he fears what I'm about to show you now. Okay, so two options. Castle's main move, let's go over knight b d2 and just briefly. Whoa. Okay, knight b to d2. Now, here's the point of knight b d7, or one of the points, knight b6. And white, of course, has played knight d2. White could also play knight a3. Black shouldn't really give up this bishop, but knight b d2 is safer. And now knight c4, queen a4 check, and after bishop to d7, white takes back. And I mean, this is equal. This bishop is going to be great on c6. White should castle, and black just develops normally. For example, bishop g5 and castles, and something like rook c1 and rook c8 and rook d1 and maybe queen d6 or queen d5. It's just an equal position. So this is not the way to play for an advantage with white. That being said, you could have success with a sort of minority attack on the queen side, provoking moves like b6. So let me give you an example. So for example, here, instead of rook e1, you play b4. And now, for example, b6. Now if b6 happens, you can already start undermining this structure. For example, queen d7 and a5. And if you can weaken something, for example, the c7 pawn or the a7 pawn, or isolate those two pawns, well, fine. But black has many ways to defend. Okay, and now let's have a look at the main move. The main move after knight b to d7 is to simply castle. And, well, playing in the Catalan style, saying, why, I don't care about this pawn. I'm not going to play queen a4 to get it straight away. I'm not going to play knight bd2 to play knight c4 straight away. I'll just castle and develop my pieces and put pressure on your position. Excuse me. So black has a lot of options. We're going to have a look at them. We're going to have a look at all of them. Some in greater detail, some in lesser detail. The main move is rook b8. Then c5 is the second most popular. We have bishop e7, we have c6, a6, and knight b6. And they all make sense. Bishop e7 is sort of copying what white is doing. Fine, you can take the pawn on the next turn. I'm also going to develop, and I don't care if you get the pawn back. All other moves prepare to defend the pawn. c6 and a6 obviously prepare to strengthen b5. Rook b8 obviously prepares b5 without being on this dangerous diagonal. c5 tries to break open white's center and develop the bishop with tempo, after which it will be easier to defend the pawn with something like queen c7. So for example, if white is not careful after c5, if he takes, then bishop takes, developing with tempo, and if something attacks the pawn, then for example queen c2, queen c7, if you take the pawn you lose the queen. That's just one example, and it's sort of better for black if white complies. So let's have a look at c5 first. Actually, after c5, white's best is just to play knight a3, and after knight b6 to go for this trade once more. So knight takes c4, knight takes d4, and now queen a4. Queen a4 getting back the piece. Bishop d7 is always the reply, and now here. And the problem for white here is that b5 gains a ton of space. You can see that because of these two bishops. White is sort of restricted. So now after queen c2, c4 would release the tension in the center, so that's not something you should consider here. Instead, black should play rook c8 and just put more pressure. And here dc5, bishop c5, and something like queen b3, and again, black should be fine. These two bishops look really good, and not too many issues for white, but white still has a lead in development. These two pawns are definitely weaker than white's pawns, and you could target them. You have the e5 square. This bishop is very good, much better than the d7 bishop for the moment, and white should have a slight advantage. Okay, that's c5. If bishop e7 is played, which is, let's say, the most prudent move for black simply trying to develop, well then you can continue with knight b to d2 if you want to take the pawn back, and that's the most common move. You can also play knight a3, you can play knight f to d2, which is an interesting option. Has been played a few times. You can play queen a4. There are a lot of moves, but they all have the same goal, just to take this pawn. Knight b6. Now queen c2, castles, knight takes c4. Now we have this trade again. Takes, and c6 to strengthen the diagonal. And this position I'm not a big fan of for black. This is, I would say, a bad version of the Semislav. Because your bishop is on c8, and because it's going to have it's going to take some time to play b6, bishop a6, and if you do play it, then c6 is very weak. And if you want to play more sensibly, then c5 would be a way to develop the bishop like this. But then why do you play c6, and then this is weak again? So logically you have to go for e5, but that's going to take time to prepare. So for example, rook e8, bishop d6, or rook e8, queen d6, or rook e8, e5, and then see what happens. So I'm not a big fan of this position. So bishop e7 passive. c6 and a6 should both be met with an advance on the queen side with a4, and you basically prevent an easy b5. So here against c6, a4, black should continue with a5, because a5 from white was a threat. And now after queen c2, you can see that, for example, knight b6, knight bd2, white is going to get his pawn back. So for example, bishop e7, takes, and now whose squares are weaker? I don't know, to be honest. I would say that white's bishop is better, and that's very important in correlation to these pawns and these squares. So I would say white's position is slightly better. The same goes for a6. You just play a4, and now a5 is not the answer because you're moving the same pawn twice, but rook b8, and after a5, again b5 is prevented, so you can take en passant. So bishop d6, for example, knight bd2, and b5 now has to be played to defend the pawn, but a b6 and knight b6 to defend the pawn, knight c4, queen a4, bishop d7, we have the same continuation. And again, because of this weakness here, I would definitely say that white is better. The material is equal for the moment, black has the move bishop b5, but the pawn is always going to be weak. And also, white king is already safe, white has a great bishop on g2, especially after he plays knight e5, so no problem. Okay. Then finally, before we get onto the main line with rook b8, I would like to look at knight b6, which in this position, since white has castled, is probably the most straightforward way to continue playing after knight bd7. So white plays knight bd2, and now he's going to take. You don't have a way to defend, but you have time for c5. And after knight c4, knight c4, queen a4, bishop d7 takes. I think this is a nice position. You can continue rook c8 once you defend the a7 pawn. You can play b5 straight away. We've already seen this, and again, this should be pleasant. Queen c2, we already looked at this position. Rook c8, and now dc5. Bishop g5 can also be played. Okay, and the main line is rook to b8. Now, there are a couple of ways to play this position. b6, oh, excuse me, rook to b8. a4 should be played by white, trying to simply prevent an easy b5, because if b5, then you take it, and this is just dreadful. So against a4, there are two moves, basically, three moves. In a game played between Vidit and Carlsen, Carlsen continued b6, and Vidit played knight bd2. Carlsen played bishop a6, and after queen c2, or excuse me, yeah, Carlsen was black, and in this position c3 was played, trying to, well, dissolve the pawn that way. There are other options, of course. I think c5 is one of the better options, just breaking through the center. So b6 is a way to play, try to consolidate the queen side. You're going to give the pawn back, that's not questionable. So, for example, here, like this. Also after a4, as black, you can continue with a5, simply preventing a5, and that's not a problem for white. You continue knight b to d2, and after knight b6, queen c2, again we will have this trade. Well, for example, bishop b7, again we are going to get this trade, and black is going to be playing for b5, after which a5 is going to be weak. And finally, what's the most common move? That's a6, and now you will get b5 eventually, and of course white continues a5, and of course b5 will be met with en passant, but rook is on b8, so this is sort of an English in reverse idea, where white plays rook b1 and plays on the b file, declines a trade on the a file. So in this position, black could play b5 straight away, of course a b6, and you don't want to take with the c pawn, even though that looks really nice, and if you're given time playing b5 and great position, you don't want to take with the c pawn because of bishop f4. And I think this is something you have to know as black, and you have to know how to exploit as white, because now if you play rook b7, then I take on a6. And if you take rook a8, then I play knight e5, and well, that's kind of embarrassing, because if you play rook a7 now, then I'm going to play knight c6. So against b5, a b6, it's not perfect for black, because he has to take with the rook. And after rook takes, white continues knight bd2, and again, this one, the c4 pawn is dropping. The a6 pawn is much weaker than the b2 pawn. So I don't think b5 straight away is the best option. Instead, bishop d6 to prevent this idea of bishop f4. And now, of course, after b5, a b6, you can take with the knight, you can take with the c pawn. So after knight bd2, b5, a takes b6. taking with the b pawn, with the c pawn, excuse me, is possible, but knight takes c4, and again, let's say bishop to c7, bishop to d2. These two are again slightly weaker. You're losing the c4 pawn, so these two will be targets. So that's not as common. More common is to take with the knight, to actually temporarily defend the pawn. So knight takes, queen a4, bishop d7, and queen takes c4. And again, you get this idea of bishop e5 and putting pressure on the e2 pawn and on the f1 rook. We saw this position already. Okay, let's just have a brief look at the main line once more. Excuse me. So a4, a6, a5, bishop to d6, excuse me, knight b to d2. Okay, and after knight b to d2, b5, a takes b6, knight takes b6. Now in this position, you don't have to take on c4 straight away. There are more moves in this position. You can play b3 and not losing time to get the pawn. You can play queen c2 before you take. You can also play knight e5, which is very interesting, offering a trade of knight for bishop, dislodging the f6 knight if that's taken, threatening knight c6. And you can also play e4. So there are a lot of attacking options in this position. And I think the position is definitely easier for white to play. This is a very thematic position, and that's why I would like to stop here. It's not really theoretical. I think there have been maybe 5 games from this position, maybe 6, something like that. But knowing the plans is important. Knowing that you are going to be putting pressure on black's queen side, more so than on the king side, which is usually what happens in the Catalan. And also knowing that you can simply ignore this pawn. You don't have to trade your knight for his knight and go into that sort of equal position. There are many interesting ways to continue here. For example, e4 just threatens 2 pieces. So if bishop e7, then knight e5. And now you're threatening knight c6, you're threatening knight c4. You can play queen h5 if this knight moves. So it's getting interesting. So try to improvise. And since there are no Grandmaster games from this position, or very few. There's actually a game by Bogdan Lalic played last year. Bogdan Lalic won. He had the white pieces here. He's a Croatian grandmaster. And try to analyze by yourself. Okay, thank you very much for watching. We are going to continue with the next move very soon, tomorrow, and we are going to be looking at bishop e7 in the next video. Oh, excuse me. So the third rarest move. And I hope you're enjoying the series on the Catalan so far. Again, there's a link to the whole playlist in the description. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.